Last night at my rehearsal dinner, my half-sister decided to remind everyone, again, that she once went on a couple of dates with my fiancé. 6 years ago. We're both 28 now, she's 26, but to hear her tell it, you'd think it was the romance of the century instead of a short-lived fling no one even remembers. She wouldn't stop working it into the conversation, and eventually the whole night felt like her personal stage. My fiancé finally snapped and shut her down in front of everyone. Then my dad added to the chaos with an ultimatum so serious it could have changed who walked me down the aisle. What he demanded would have changed my wedding tomorrow, and I had to decide fast. Here's the thing though, all of this drama started with one flimsy piece of history that shouldn't have mattered at all. The backstory nobody wanted. So let's rewind to the one piece of history my half-sister keeps weaponizing, the so-called fling. 6 years ago, before I ever met my fiancé, she matched with him on a dating app. They went out twice, both nights casual, both nights mostly forgettable. He later admitted he found her clingy and overbearing, so he ended things almost immediately. It was nothing. 2 dinners, some awkward small talk, and then silence. Years later, I met him in a completely separate way, and the connection between us actually stuck. By then, those 2 dates with her were long in the rearview mirror. For me and him, the whole subject was background noise when it first came up. He mentioned it casually, I didn't care, and that was that. But for her, those 2 tiny blips grew into a saga she never let go of. She started telling the story like she'd discovered him first, like she had early access rights to a movie the rest of us were only seeing now. It wasn't enough to say, yeah, we went out. She inflated it into something grander, insisting it mattered more than it ever did. The truth is, she and I have never been close. We grew up in the same orbit, but half-sisters describes it more than friends ever could. My relationship with her has always been distant at best, strained if I'm being polite. She has this competitive streak where everything somehow becomes a comparison. If I got praise for a test score, she reminded everyone of one she got slightly higher years earlier. If someone liked my outfit, she needed to announce how much hers cost. Even as kids, she wasn't looking for closeness, she was looking for ways to one-up me. So when I got engaged, it was almost like the universe had handed her the crown jewel of bragging rights. My fiancé wasn't just someone she knew, he was someone she'd technically dated, if you can even call 2 awkward dinners dating. Instead of letting it stay what it was, she turned it into her favorite bit of trivia. It became her little badge of honor, something she'd drop into conversations like she was doing a public service. The worst part? She says it like she deserves recognition. It's not even bitter, not even framed as an old flame she wishes turned out differently. She leans into it with this smug little tone, like having met him before me makes her special. Imagine someone bragging that they ate at a restaurant once before it got popular. That's what it feels like, random, irrelevant, and yet delivered like news everyone should clap for. Whenever she brings it up, the room gets uncomfortable. She'll casually say something like, "Oh, when I went out with him," as if it's a fun fact worth repeating. People nod awkwardly, smile too hard, and then change the subject, but she won't notice. And me? I'm stuck choosing between rolling my eyes or pretending it doesn't get under my skin. It's exhausting to hear the same story dredged up again and again in different packaging. Meanwhile, my actual relationship, the one where we weathered real challenges, made commitments, and planned a future together, gets overshadowed for her by this ancient footnote. To her, the trivia is the headline, not the marriage that's about to start. It's absurd, but it's exactly how she operates. Inflate small things, cling to them, and repeat them until she gets a reaction. I tried, for a while, to brush it off. I told myself no one really cared, that everyone around her saw through the exaggeration. And I think that's partly true. Most people look uncomfortable rather than impressed whenever she brings it up. But even so, her constant reminders created this weird tension, like I was being forced to acknowledge her connection, whether I wanted to or not. It's one thing to laugh off old stories. It's another to be repeatedly told your soon-to-be husband once went on 2 awkward dinners with your sister, as though that fact is essential to your daily life. It left me wondering why she needed it so badly. Maybe because she's always craved being noticed. Maybe because competing with me has been her default since childhood. Whatever the reason, she never let it fade into the background. She polished up those 2 insignificant dates and displayed them at every chance she got. No one remembered them until she reminded us, and then re-reminded us, and then repeated it again just to be sure. And as irritating as all of that was in normal family settings, it became a much bigger problem once wedding events started. Her favorite anecdote suddenly became her go-to line at parties, showers, and anywhere else people gathered. Every toast was an opening, every casual conversation another chance to force it into the room. What could have stayed a laughable detail grew into this presence I couldn't avoid. Which brings me to the part that mattered most. I never wanted her there to begin with. My instinct told me involving her would come with trouble. But what I wanted and what actually happened turned out to be very different things. And that difference, the decision to let her in when I didn't want to, set the stage for everything that blew up later. Why she got invited anyway. Weddings have this tricky way of forcing people into choices that don't feel natural, and for me, putting my half-sister on the guest list was exactly that. Left to my own judgment, she wouldn't have been anywhere near the seating chart. Not because I wanted drama, not because I wanted to exclude family, but simply because we don't have the kind of bond that justifies her being part of a day that's supposed to feel intimate. The only reason she ended up with an invitation was my dad. He leaned hard on the idea of family unity, insisting that seeing both his daughters there would mean the world to him. At one point, he even suggested inviting his wife, who I've never had a good relationship with, before finally circling back to Maddie. Dad pushed so hard, he even suggested inviting his wife, and eventually I caved on Maddie just to keep the peace. It wasn't some dramatic fight that led to my surrender. It was the slow drip of pressure, that where you down sort of negotiation where every conversation circles back to the same point, and you're just so tired of fending it off that you give in. My dad would phrase it like a plea more than a demand, telling me that having both daughters present would show the world we'd all manage to come together. It wasn't about Maddie herself. It was about Dad wanting a picture-perfect moment. Here's the part that still gnaws at me. Even while I was agreeing, I knew it was a mistake. It's one thing to ignore a bad feeling because you're overthinking. It's another when every single gut instinct is flashing red lights. I told myself that giving him what he wanted would head off unnecessary conflict, that one small concession now was worth his happiness later. In hindsight, that one concession was the match lighting everything up. The truth is, weddings aren't just about who you genuinely cherish. They're about politics, little deals and compromises people make to avoid friction. Everyone has at least one name on the guest list that's there because someone insisted. It might be an old friend of a parent, a relative you barely see, or someone you know will cause tension if excluded. For me, Maddie was the glaring example of that. She was my non-negotiable, not in a way I chose, but in the way my dad made it clear I had no say. It's almost ironic, because my dad justified her invitation as a way of keeping the peace. His reasoning was that leaving her out would only stir bitterness and conflict, that including her was the safer route. But when you give someone like Maddie a platform, she won't just stand quietly in the corner. She'll climb onto it, adjust the lights, and start putting on a performance. The very act of inviting her created the exact situation Dad thought he was avoiding. And here's what makes the whole thing worse. I predicted it. I could see the future playing out before it even happened, and still I ignored that instinct. It was like watching a plate teetering at the edge of a countertop, knowing it would crash, and deciding to balance it there anyway because someone insisted it looked nice. Sure enough, the crash came. When I think about the arguments with my dad, what stands out is how he brushed off every concern I raised. I'd bring up Maddie's history of making everything about herself, and he'd wave it away with lines like, "It's just one day," or "Don't let her get to you." His whole philosophy was built on minimizing the problem, as though pretending Maddie's behavior wasn't an issue would magically keep her in line. But the second those invitations were sent out, any control I had over the situation was gone. Maddie had an opening, and she wasn't going to waste it. From the outside, inviting her might sound trivial, like it was just one extra chair at a big party. But anyone who's dealt with difficult family members knows how powerful just one person's presence can be. It doesn't matter how many people are relaxed and supportive in the room. If one person thrives on shifting attention to themselves, they can tilt the whole dynamic. Maddie wasn't just one more name on a list. She was an unstable element dropped right into the middle of something I wanted to keep steady. I sometimes replay those conversations with Dad and imagine standing my ground. What if I'd said no and let him sulk for a week? What if I had drawn a hard line about who was welcome? Would he have eventually gotten over it, even if it bruised his sense of picture-perfect family pride? Probably. But I convinced myself I couldn't risk it, and I leaned into keeping him satisfied over keeping myself at peace. That trade-off seemed worth it in the moment, and I think that's what makes the fallout sting so much, not just Maddie's behavior, but the knowledge that I'd given her the chance. She didn't steal her way into the wedding events. I opened the door myself. I let the pressure win. I turned away from my own instincts because I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing my dad. When I look back on it now, that moment wasn't just a tiny compromise. It was the start of everything else that followed. The rest of the drama, the stories, the reminders she kept slipping into conversations, the escalation into bigger scenes can all be traced right back to that first choice. If she hadn't been there, those problems wouldn't have taken root. She needed the audience the wedding events provided, and Dad made sure she'd get one. And once she had that audience, she didn't waste any time. Long before the rehearsal dinner exploded, I got my first preview of what was coming, and sure enough, the warnings started early. The engagement party, red flags. The engagement party should have been the safe, easy part, the kind of night where everyone eats finger food, swaps polite stories, and smiles for photos they'll never print. For most people, it's a warm-up before wedding week really ramps up. For Maddie, though, it turned into something else entirely. Instead of blending into the celebration, she treated it like an audition, using every conversation as a chance to weave in those tired two-date memories with my fiancé. She didn't start loud, but the pattern was obvious. She'd lean back mid-conversation, wait for a pause, and then casually insert herself. "Oh, he's always been a picky eater," she mentioned, or he used to text really quickly. On the surface, harmless details, except the point wasn't what she said, but how she said it. Every remark came with that smirk, the kind of look that screamed, "I know something you don't." These weren't stories anyone asked for. They were little status updates designed to remind the room she had some kind of history with him, no matter how flimsy. But the moment that stuck with me most came when someone asked about my fiancé and me, how we met, where our first date was. It should have been a happy story, lighthearted and sweet. I had barely started to answer when she cut me off, swooping in with, "Oh, that's funny. When we went out, he always used to," and then wandered into a bland little anecdote about dessert. It didn't just interrupt, it sucked the air out of the moment, leaving me with a half-finished sentence and everyone else staring like they'd been dropped into the wrong conversation. That was the tone of the evening. Not devastating, not explosive, just relentlessly misplaced. She wasn't shouting secrets across the room, she wasn't sharing anything scandalous, but she was determined to make herself part of every story. It was like watching someone replay deleted scenes nobody asked to see, convinced the film can't make sense without them. The reactions around her were hard to miss. I caught the flickers, tight smiles, quick glances exchanged when she chimed in again, the polite little nods that meant people didn't know how to respond without escalating it. Nobody laughed, not genuinely. Nobody leaned in, curious for more. But Maddie interpreted their politeness as interest, which only fueled her persistence. Through it all, my fiancé and I stuck to one strategy: ignoring. Looking back, it wasn't really about patience or maturity, it was about avoiding a bigger scene. We had no interest in turning one person's weird attempts at relevance into the headline of the night. If we reacted, she'd have something to work with. If we didn't, maybe she'd run out of material. That was the hope anyway. And for anyone wondering why we didn't shut her down right then, it was simple. We were trying to protect the peace, to keep our engagement party focused on the reason everyone was there, not on her. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to brush off. My relatives whispered on the side. Friends looked at me with awkward sympathy, and still Maddie kept circling back to her greatest hits, small, outdated insights no one valued. It reminded me of someone stepping back on stage for the fourth encore, even when the audience had already packed up their coats. By the end of the evening, we convinced ourselves it was manageable. Embarrassing, yes, but survivable. A passing discomfort on the road to bigger celebrations. On the way home, I remember thinking she'd gotten it out of her system, that maybe she just needed that one night to feel included. That's how we rationalized it, quietly hoping this was the peak of her attention-seeking. We didn't realize at the time that this wasn't her peak at all. It was only the rehearsal, her chance to test material she planned on recycling again and again in louder ways. We thought it was annoying, not the opening act for a much bigger scene. The bragging hits overdrive. At first, it felt like something we could shrug off. One offhand mention here or there, and you tell yourself it's not worth addressing. But as the weeks rolled on and the wedding got closer, Maddie didn't just keep at it, she escalated. She went from slipping the story into casual conversations to making it her signature contribution every time people gathered. Bridal shower? She worked it in. Dress fitting? She circled the talk right back to herself. Even brunches that weren't connected to the wedding became a stage for her stale story. It reached a point where you could expect it like clockwork. At least once per event, she would find a way to remind people. What started as mild awkwardness soon turned into something that dragged down the mood. She wasn't reminiscing, she was rehearsing. She had one anecdote and she kept dredging it back up with the enthusiasm of someone convinced she held rare knowledge. And when she said it, she didn't deliver it sheepishly. She delivered it with the confidence of an MC handing out headliner announcements. The story wasn't worth that kind of delivery, not once and certainly not on its fifth retelling, but she performed it as though it were top-tier material every time. The deliberate nature of her timing became impossible to ignore. Maddie stopped waiting for natural pauses in conversation. She began inserting her comments no matter the subject. If someone mentioned travel plans, she would chime in with, "Oh, he used to tell me he wanted to take trips with me." If guests complimented the venue, she'd tack on, "We once talked about going somewhere like this." It wasn't accidental. She was intentionally anchoring herself to fresh topics, bringing the discussion back toward her connection with him. And it wore on everyone. The smugness she carried while doing it made matters worse. She wasn't oblivious to the reaction in the room. No, she looked around with an air that suggested pride, as though these reminders were something she was entitled to flash before the crowd. She positioned herself as though recounting the past kept her relevant in the present. It wasn't nostalgia or even humor, it was posturing. She wanted people to notice, and she fed off the discomfort when they clearly did. It became clear to others outside of us, too. Family and friends began catching her pattern. My maid of honor admitted later that one night, just out of curiosity, she started counting. By the end of a single bridal event, Maddie had referenced those 2 dates exactly 7 times. 7 mentions of something insignificant, crammed into one gathering. That wasn't casual slip-ups, that was persistence. And hearing that tally put into numbers made the obsession impossible to deny. All the while, my fiancé and I agreed to ignore her. That seemed like the safest option at the time. If we acted like it mattered, we'd only deepen the spectacle. But the strategy backfired. She mistook silence for a sign she was getting to us. Each time she pushed, our lack of response only encouraged her to push harder, as though she had found a vulnerable spot that gave her leverage. Our attempt to preserve civility ended up handing her confidence. I started noticing the toll it was taking on him, even as he tried to keep his calm. He fidgeted more, tightened his grip on his glass when she spoke, cleared his throat with a hint of frustration. At home afterward, we'd sit in silence that stretched longer than either of us liked, both of us replaying her unnecessary remarks. For me, it was that constant low buzz in the back of my mind, impossible to switch off. These weren't just random quips anymore, they began to sting. Her persistence also shifted the atmosphere at every event. What was supposed to be celebratory felt laced with unease, like everyone kept waiting for the moment she would wedge herself into the spotlight again. Guests who came to be cheerful ended up exchanging looks, caught between being polite and being visibly uncomfortable. What should have been bright, easy gatherings carried an undercurrent of tension because one person was determined to hold court over something meaningless. We tried subtle redirections, starting new conversations, smiling without responding, even physically stepping away from her when she began again. Nothing slowed her down. If anything, she doubled down when she sensed she wasn't being acknowledged. It was as if in her mind the lack of enthusiasm proved she'd hit a nerve, and hitting that nerve became part of her game. The turning point for me was realizing she didn't flinch when others gave her signals to stop. Anyone else would gauge the room, catch the stiffness in people's smiles, and ease off. Maddie either didn't register those cues or, worse, reveled in them. She seemed almost energized by the awkwardness. That was when I knew this wasn't harmless oversharing. She was doing it willfully. She wanted the discomfort because it guaranteed attention. The pressure built quietly but steadily between me and my fiancé as the days passed. Even though we didn't argue about it, there was this constant shared weight pressing down on both of us. Each I knew him first remark chipped away at our ability to stay gracious. Our chosen tactic of ironic smiles and practiced nods was wearing thin. By the week of the wedding, even polite nods began to slip into tight-lipped silence. And still, Maddie carried herself as though she was delivering something important. Every time she launched into her line, the gap between her belief and reality widened. She carried on like she was central to the evening, when in truth she had reduced herself to background noise that grated on everyone present. She mistook tolerance for admiration, not realizing people were waiting for her to stop. This dragged on until the events piled into the final night before the wedding. By then, it wasn't just irritation simmering in the background. It was expectation. The guests who walked into that evening knew her pattern and braced for it like a storm they couldn't avoid. The build-up from all her interruptions and boastful comments changed the atmosphere in a way you could feel before anyone even sat down. And it was in that charged setting, when the tension had quietly stacked higher than anyone wanted to admit, that the real breaking point arrived. Rehearsal dinner explosion. Rehearsal dinners are supposed to be straightforward. People relax, eat, share a few polite words, and head home feeling like the wedding will run smoothly the next day. That was the plan. For about 30 minutes, it even felt like things would go that way. Guests had food on their plates, glasses in their hands, and conversations rolling easily. Then Maddie slipped back into her routine, and the ease of the evening immediately disappeared. This time, she didn't even dress it up with new material. Right in the middle of a toast, she cut through the laughter with another tired comment about how she used to know him better than anyone back in the day. The line landed with the same weight as before, none, but the interruption itself tilted the room. You could see people pause, glance down at their food, or exchange quiet looks that said, "Here we go again." It should have been forgettable, like all her other reminders, but it came at the wrong time in the wrong place. What she hadn't calculated was that my fiancé had finally reached his limit. For weeks, she had been testing his composure, and he had quietly absorbed it all, but this time the restraint snapped. Later, he told me what finally cracked. It wasn't just that comment, it was the build-up, the countless reminders paired with the memory that years ago, after only 2 dates, she had actually called his mother a few days later. He'd seen that as a red flag back then, the kind of intensity that felt invasive and unsettling. So when she stood there at the dinner table acting like a pair of awkward dinners had given her special insight, he couldn't swallow it any longer. He saw the same obsessive streak resurfacing, and this time, instead of keeping quiet, he spoke up. The words didn't ease out. They cut across the table like a sharp break in rhythm. He told her, clearly and bluntly, that it was inappropriate to keep dragging up something so minor, and weird for her to act as if 2 long-forgotten outings made her relevant to his life now. He pointed out that she had clung to this narrative for months, repeating it like it mattered, when in reality it was nothing but an embarrassing footnote no one wanted to hear again. His voice was louder than usual, sharper than usual, and it silenced the room instantly. For once, it was everything other people had tiptoed around finally spelled out. He didn't just roll his eyes or redirect. He gave specific examples. He reminded her that those so-called memories came from only 2 meaningless evenings, and he called out how obsessive it looked to keep using them as currency in front of family and friends. He even said directly that it was coming across as creepy, and people understood what he meant exactly, because now they saw it too. Maddie froze. The confidence that carried her into every conversation disappeared. Her face turned red and her mouth opened like she was searching for a comeback, but nothing formed. For the first time, the script she had relied on collapsed. Everyone else had known it was awkward, but once he said it aloud, the whole room recalibrated. The smug interruptions no longer looked playful. They looked desperate. Only silence followed. Not the light kind where people wait for the next toast, but the heavy kind where uncertainty hangs in the air. A few people fiddled with their forks, some lowered their eyes, but no one stepped in to shield her. The balance of the room shifted, and where Maddie usually had command just by speaking, she now sat exposed with nothing to cling to. And then the reaction turned a corner. Her eyes welled, and before anyone could decide how to move next, she broke into loud sobs. She pushed her chair back, stood abruptly, and ran out of the room, clutching her face. Every pair of eyes swiveled toward her exit as the sound of her crying trailed down the hall. Seconds later, my dad got up and followed her, leaving the rest of us behind in stunned silence. The quiet that settled in didn't last long. Relief hit me almost immediately, relief that someone had finally said out loud what weighed on me for weeks, and relief that I wasn't alone in feeling suffocated by her antics. For my fiancé, it was the release of pent-up frustration, the chance to reclaim control of something Maddie kept sabotaging. But alongside that came discomfort. This wasn't just another pre-wedding hiccup. Guests who had traveled for the wedding were suddenly pulled into family drama at what should have been a routine dinner. they'd remember it, and not for the food or the speeches, but for Maddie sobbing her way out of the room. The irony was impossible to ignore. Maddie had tried so hard to keep herself in the middle of every event, desperate to tie herself to my fiancé's story, and she succeeded, but in the worst possible way. Now she wasn't the narrator, she was the cautionary tale caught out in front of everyone. What she hoped would make her look special instead left her humiliated. People drifted back into their conversations slowly after she left, but there was a tightness in the air you couldn't shake. Nobody wanted to be the one to comment on what just happened, but everyone was thinking about it. The image of Maddie crying her way out and my dad following her had already fixed itself into the memory of the night. And while most people probably hoped that would be the end of it, that the next day, the wedding would go on without more drama, what actually came was far more complicated. Because as much as that outburst changed the room, it was only the beginning of the fallout. And what happened immediately afterward took the night in a direction none of us could have imagined. Dad's unexpected ultimatum. It would have made sense for the evening to wind down after Maddie left the room in tears. Guests were already shaken by the tension, and plenty of people were ready to close out the night and focus on the wedding day ahead. But then my dad stood up, and instead of smoothing things over, he introduced an entirely new problem. Up until that point, he hadn't been saying much. He wasn't laughing at Maddie's constant interruptions, but he hadn't defended me or my fiancé either. He mostly sat back, sipping his drink, keeping himself in the background. That's why it hit so hard when he decided that was the moment to speak. In the silence following Maddie's exit, he took the floor, and instead of pointing to the source of all the disruption, he pointed straight at us. His words landed like a hammer. He announced, in front of all our family and friends, that I owed Maddie an apology. He said my fiancé had gone too far by calling her out in front of everyone, and that the only way to fix it was to make amends before the ceremony. Then came the ultimatum, clear and unshakable. Unless we apologized, he would not walk me down the aisle. There was no hesitation, no half measures. He said it simply, like a fact, and then let the words hang in the air. The silence that followed this was heavier than anything earlier in the night. Before, people were shocked at my fiancé's blunt honesty. Now they were stunned that my own father would take such a stance. I could see relatives exchange quick, uneasy glances across the table. Some looked horrified, others stared at their plates, and a few didn't even try to hide their disbelief. Meanwhile, Maddie regained her composure and slipped back into her seat, looking smug, almost satisfied that my dad had rushed to her side in such a dramatic fashion. Her earlier humiliation had been wiped away, replaced by the glow of being publicly defended. The injustice of it burned. We had let weeks of Maddie's behavior slide without making a scene. My fiancé finally pushed back when she went too far, and instead of recognizing the buildup that had led there, my dad decided to penalize us. It reminded me of a referee ignoring every foul until the very end, then blowing the whistle only when the other team finally fought back. The whole thing felt upside down, and what made it worse was the leverage behind his threat. My mom passed away a few years ago. Dad is my only living parent. Having him walk me down the aisle wasn't just tradition, it mattered more than ever. It was one of the few symbolic pieces of my wedding I knew I couldn't replace. So when he said he wouldn't do it unless we apologized, it cut deep. It wasn't just about siding with Maddie. It was about using the one role I had always pictured him in as a bargaining chip. I kept my face steady, but inside I was boiling. I wanted to snap back, to ask him how he could possibly blame me or my fiancé after weeks of Maddie's antics. But I also knew if I or my fiancé argued right then, the rehearsal dinner would lose what was left of its dignity. Under the table, I pressed my knee against my fiancé's to keep him grounded. He looked ready to fire back, his jaw tight and fists clenched, but he stayed quiet. I knew one more outburst could turn things into a complete disaster. Around me, the room barely moved. Guests busied themselves with sipping drinks or fiddling with forks, trying to pretend they didn't just witness the father of the bride publicly threaten to step out of the most important role he had left. That's what it felt like. The evening had morphed from a celebratory dinner into something closer to a courtroom, where judgment was handed down before evidence was even considered, and the guilty party was me. The betrayal was hard to swallow. He was supposed to be in my corner. Parents might stress over the little things during wedding prep, the seating chart, the costs, the logistics, but when the day itself comes near, you expect them to be a steady source of support. My dad flipped that on its head. Instead of holding Maddie accountable, he handed her validation and left me scrambling hours before the wedding. I pretended to sip my drink as my mind raced. The worst-case scenario flashed in my head, walking down the aisle alone. Or worse, rushing to pull someone else into the role at the last minute while guests whispered about the drama. The thought made my stomach clench. Nothing about this situation was fair, but that image alone, the possibility of my dad not being there, the empty space where he should be, was unbearable. Some guests made attempts at small talk to ease the tension, but the smiles were thin, the conversations hollow. The room was fractured, divided by an ultimatum that no one should have heard. Maddie stayed quiet now, but the self-satisfied curve of her mouth said everything. She had managed to shift the focus off her behavior and onto us. My dad had done the work for her, and she sat enjoying the victory. Dessert made its way to the tables, but I barely tasted anything. All I could do was sit between my fiancé's silence, Maddie's smirk, and my dad's hard stare. The joy I should have carried into my wedding day felt weighed down by the impossible choice ahead of me: give my half-sister an apology she didn't deserve, or face walking down the aisle without my only parent by my side. I couldn't believe he'd picked that moment to demand it, and now I had less than 24 hours to decide what to do. Bride's breaking point. When the rehearsal dinner finally ended and I made it back home, that's when the weight of it hit me. The night should have marked the last stretch before the wedding, when planning stress finally gave way to excitement. Instead, I sat frozen on my bed, my phone buzzing with unanswered messages, trying to process what had just unfolded. My own father had thrown down an ultimatum tied to the most personal moment a bride could imagine. And suddenly, it wasn't just about Maddie's endless need for attention anymore. It was about my dad, his loyalty, and whether I was still expected to keep swallowing indignities in the name of peace. The timing sharpened everything. A wedding already piles pressure on your brain: seating charts, flower deliveries, bridal party nerves, last-minute checks on whether the dress will sit right. All of that should have been my focus, but instead, it was squeezed against something absurd. Dad might not walk me down the aisle unless I apologized to Maddie for a conflict she caused. And this wasn't weeks out, where there might have been space to solve it with cool heads. The ceremony was less than 24 hours away. I didn't have the luxury of time. The image wouldn't leave my head. My dad standing there in front of everyone, stone-faced, saying it without hesitation. He'd forced his declaration into a moment that should have belonged to joy and family connection, and the part that cut deeper than his ultimatum was Maddie's face while he said it. That smirk, like she'd just won something she'd been working toward, stuck with me harder than the words themselves. She wasn't embarrassed anymore. She was vindicated. Inside, my thoughts ricocheted in every direction. One part of me whispered, just apologize. Let Dad have his way, let Maddie think she's won, and then move forward without added disruption. That choice would keep the ceremony neat and protect the picture I'd always imagined: Dad beside me for the walk everyone expected. It was the quick, clean option, at least on the surface. But then the other part of me pushed hard against that. Why should I carry the blame? I hadn't dragged old trivia into every family event. I hadn't provoked my fiancé until he snapped. I hadn't turned celebrations into power plays. That had been Maddie from the start, and everyone knew it. For my dad to make me the one who had to bend in order to soothe her pride, it flipped the truth on its head. And if I gave in now, what message did that send? That Maddie could stage her drama, demand the spotlight, and succeed as long as she cried at the right time? That future stretched out bleak if I let this one apology dictate the pattern. The push and pull left me exhausted. Would my dignity mean more years from now than that symbolic walk at the wedding? Or would I look back and regret turning a once-in-a-lifetime moment into a standoff? It didn't feel like a simple choice. It felt like standing at a fork where either road meant losing something important: my principles or my picture of the day. The worst part was that my fiancé had no gray area in this. His anger burned too brightly to even entertain the idea. To him, the answer was firm: no apologies, period. He argued that bowing down would only cement their control, that letting Maddie and my dad dictate the terms on our wedding would poison the memory even more than walking alone. And while I shared his frustration, I couldn't help thinking about the political reality. Weddings aren't just love stories. They're family arenas too, and that made the choice far less clean. At one point, when my thoughts refused to stop circling, I grabbed a pen and wrote it plainly. 2 paths? Apologize, Dad smiles, aisle moment intact, Maddie smug but satisfied. Or refuse, Dad steps away, no illusion of unity, but I hold my ground beside the man I chose to marry. It didn't take a full page of reasoning to see it. One path was survival that tasted bitter. The other was risk that carried principle. Laying it out didn't banish the fear, but it stripped away the endless loops in my head. Every tick of the clock made the decision heavier. This wasn't some someday dilemma. The morning was racing toward me like a wall I'd have to hit hard. Brides are supposed to savor their last calm hours, maybe sip champagne with the bridal party and drift into daydreams of the aisle ahead. Instead, my countdown sounded like, do you betray yourself or brace for disaster? The narrowing of that timeline squeezed me tighter with every passing hour, and in the background of all of it was Maddie. Her presence in my thoughts stung even when she wasn't in the room. I could see her walking ahead of me at the wedding, shoulders squared with shameless pride, whispering to relatives about how I'd made things right. Even the possibility made me sick. She had already stolen every event leading up to this one. The idea of surrendering the wedding day itself, it made my skin crawl. That's when my perspective shifted. This wasn't just a wedding problem anymore. It was bigger. It was about whether I was going to keep folding whenever a family member decided to pull rank over my boundaries. If I yielded now, what would stop my dad from weaponizing other roles or traditions whenever Maddie stirred fresh drama? Walking down the aisle wasn't just about that single moment anymore. It had become a measure of how much of myself I was willing to trade away. The answer I landed on wasn't wrapped neatly with a bow. It didn't feel triumphant or easy. It felt like staring at two bad outcomes and choosing which one I could live with more. Short-term fallout versus long-term resentment. One guaranteed tears and awkward silence. The other guaranteed a lifetime of knowing I'd sold out the piece of me that mattered most. By the time the night drained into silence, I sat straighter, my lists crumpled, my phone still buzzing beside me. The noise in my head hadn't vanished, but one truth had risen above it all. I couldn't delay anymore. A line had to be drawn. I wasn't going to escape either kind of fallout, but I could at least decide which one I was willing to carry forward. And so, exhausted but clear in a way I hadn't been before, I accepted it. The moment for hesitation was behind me. The confrontation was inevitable. I had to pick today. The confrontation round 2. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I woke up knowing exactly what had to happen. I needed to confront my dad directly. There was no way to sidestep it or bury it under ceremony prep. The conversation had to happen before the wedding moved forward and before guests started gathering again. My fiancé and I had stayed up half the night going in circles, but by morning our decision was simple. We weren't apologizing. Not me, not him. If apologies were owed at all, they should have been coming from Maddie. Still, Dad had put the ultimatum out there, and facing him head-on was the only way forward. We didn't want another argument unfolding in front of relatives, so we drove to his house early, coffees in hand. I told myself that starting in a private, calm space might give us a chance to actually resolve something. But I already knew what it would feel like walking through that door, a negotiation tilted heavily to one side. My fiancé and I had facts, context, weeks of tension to point to. Dad had guilt tactics and the emotional weight of parental authority. The odds weren't equal, and I felt the imbalance the second he opened the door. He wore that disappointed look parents save for when they want you to feel small before you've even spoken. We sat down at his kitchen table, coffee cups sitting untouched like stage props. At first, we laid everything out as plainly as we could. I explained how Maddie had been stirring drama for weeks, how her comments weren't harmless jokes but deliberate jabs, and how the explosion at the rehearsal didn't come out of nowhere. It was the inevitable result of her constant needling. My fiancé added details too, calmly, pointing out that he had held his patience longer than anyone should have had to. But none of it landed. To Dad, the only thing that counted was the scene he had witnessed, his younger daughter crying in front of the family. Everything leading up to that moment may as well have never happened. He zeroed in on appearances, the humiliation she felt, the tears, the embarrassment. As far as he was concerned, that was the only evidence that mattered. Listening to him, it felt like being in a courtroom where the jury walked in, saw 30 seconds of the final outburst, and delivered a ruling without seeing all the testimony that came before. Then the conversation fell into a pattern that was almost surreal. My fiancé and I would give another clear example, and Dad would circle back to his refrain, "Sisters have to stick together." That was his line. He repeated it again and again, as if the words alone brushed away weeks of Maddie's behavior. An apology, he said, was the only way to fix it. It didn't matter that Maddie had been the one poking and prodding until someone snapped. In his eyes, she cried, we reacted, and that made us responsible. We pushed back. My fiancé explained, steady, not defensive, that he had spoken up out of exhaustion, not cruelty, and that ignoring Maddie forever wasn't a solution. I reminded Dad that I had tried to stay quiet just to keep things civil, but each time I let one of her remarks slide, she only escalated. What Maddie was playing at wasn't sibling teasing. She wanted a role in a story that wasn't hers, and no apology from us was going to give her that role back. I thought maybe if he heard it clearly framed, he'd recognize it. But he didn't budge. Eventually, he put his ultimatum into words again, leaving no room for interpretation. Apologize or he wouldn't walk me down the aisle. The sting of hearing it again was sharp, but I didn't flinch this time. I took a slow breath, steadied myself, and told him flatly, then I wouldn't apologize. My fiancé nodded immediately beside me in solidarity. We had already made our choice. This wasn't defiance. It was resolve. The words shifted the air in the room. Dad fell quiet, staring like he couldn't believe I wasn't bending. He launched back into one last round of guilt. We should preserve family unity. I would regret choosing pride over peace. Sisters should stand together, but I didn't let it settle. For years, I had let him and Maddie pull me into their dynamics. Not this time. This day is mine, I told him, voice steady. I won't be dictated to, not about this. It wasn't a long speech, just a simple truth. And for the first time, I saw him hesitate as I said it. We sat in heavy silence. Dad leaned back, rubbed at his face, looking older than he had the day before. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, but underneath the nerves was something new, relief. I had said what I needed to say, out loud, in front of him. My fiancé's hand squeezed mine under the table, quiet but grounding. This wasn't just another argument anymore. It was me taking the choice back into my own hands. When we finally stood to leave, nothing was resolved. Dad hadn't softened. He hadn't admitted Maddie was in the wrong, and he hadn't taken back his refusal to walk me down the aisle. The ultimatum hung right where it had been, intact and immovable. But what had changed finally was me. I'd stopped agonizing over which direction to take and planted my feet. Not on his terms, not on hers, on mine. Walking out of his house, I felt lighter in a way I hadn't in days. There was no guarantee he'd show up tomorrow ready to take my arm, but there was one guarantee: I wasn't going to let his conditions be the hinge on which my wedding turned. The cost might be steep, but at least now the decision was mine to carry. And though the drive home was quiet, the silence wasn't uncertainty this time. It was space for whatever would come next, because I knew this wasn't over yet. Dad's change of heart. It didn't happen overnight. The morning after our kitchen table standoff, my dad was still stiff, still clipped in his tone, and he avoided looking at me or my fiancé when we left. The air was cold, and I thought for a moment he might actually hold the line he had drawn. But leaving silence between us turned out to be the best move. Without me chasing him to patch things up, he was left to sit inside his own words. And when someone has to sit with what they said long enough, they eventually start to hear it the way everyone else did. The first signs of change came from others, not from him. My aunt later told me she caught him muttering under his breath about whether he had gone too far. Knowing him, that sounded about right. My dad has always been impulsive, all heat in the moment and then quiet regret after. He's not cruel, but he is quick to grab onto a dramatic stance and slower to climb down from it. That rehearsal dinner ultimatum, the threats, the stone-faced pronouncement fit his pattern. And, as always, the morning after gave way to softer edges. By late morning, the cracks in his defiance became more visible. He started speaking to relatives who had seen Maddie's behavior more clearly. One cousin in particular didn't hold back. She reminded him of the weeks of comments, the interruptions, the smugness that hung over every event she attended. It wasn't just one outburst from my fiancé. It was a pile-up Maddie had been building, dropped one brick at a time, until the wall finally toppled in front of everyone. Hearing that again from someone other than me seemed to finally nudge him out of his tunnel vision. And then something significant happened that I hadn't expected. He turned his attention back to Maddie. While I had spent the evening reeling, he spent the next morning quietly but persistently trying to get her to acknowledge her part. He asked her to apologize, to recognize what she had done and how she had escalated things. But Maddie, true to form, dug her heels in. She made it clear she had no intention of admitting anything. From what relatives later told me, it was one of the few times he stopped defending her entirely. Eventually, when she refused to budge, he told her bluntly to go home. For a man who had begged me to include her in my wedding against my better instincts, that decision said everything. He had finally flipped the lens and seen her behavior for what it was. By the evening, his whole presence changed. That rigid judge and jury posture was gone. Instead of looming with hard stares, he seemed restless, almost weighed down. When we finally found ourselves alone, he shifted awkwardly, as though rehearsing what to say. He gave me this uncertain shrug, the kind you've seen in a kid right before an apology slips out, fumbling to set words in order. And then finally, they came. He admitted he had been wrong. Wrong to throw the blame on me and my fiancé, wrong to let Maddie's tears outweigh weeks of her digging and needling, wrong to tie my most important wedding moment to an ultimatum. He said flatly that it wasn't my job to carry her resentment and that he had let her dramatics cloud his perspective. He even acknowledged without excuses that he understood my fiancé had reached his breaking point out of sheer exhaustion, not cruelty. It wasn't said in grand language, but in his voice there was something better, sincerity, hearing that felt like oxygen after being underwater. For days I had braced myself for more arguments, prepared for him to keep pressing me or holding to his line. Instead, the tension broke in one sentence after another, each one giving back a piece of solid ground I thought I would carry into my wedding missing. He told me directly that the aisle was no longer leverage. Walking me down it was not a bargaining chip. It was his responsibility, and he had lost sight of that. He promised me that nothing would stop him from being there at my side. It almost startled me how quickly he shifted once he allowed himself to. Just hours earlier, he had been the towering figure at the table, ominous with ultimatums. Now he was sheepish, clumsy in his apologies, trying to make light jokes that stumbled out, half-formed as though sugar could patch what had cracked. It was whiplash, but I recognized the rhythm. I had seen this dance before, the burst of heat, the retreat into regret, the careful rebuilding that usually followed. Except this time, it wasn't about some minor family spat. This time, the stakes were my wedding. I didn't cut him off or brush it away. I let him work through it, let him see for himself what those words had done. He even admitted he thought siding with Maddie was balancing the scales, one daughter against the other, without realizing how much damage he'd do by turning his weight against me. In his mind, it had been about stitching peace quickly. In reality, it had opened wounds between us. Saying that aloud seemed to sting him, and for once, he didn't try to soften it, but his final words mattered the most. He told me outright that the walk down the aisle should never have been conditional, that taking it from me was wrong, and that he had lost track of what mattered. He didn't excuse Maddie. He didn't frame her as misunderstood. He called her actions embarrassing, not just for me, but for him. He admitted he saw how she had tried to wedge herself into my story, and how, once he thought about it, her behavior embarrassed him in front of everyone. For a man slow to air his own mistakes, those sentences carried weight. With every word, a heaviness dropped off me. I had imagined my wedding morning poisoned, scrambling to find someone else to take his place, bracing for gossip, swallowing the sense of loss. That morning vision had gnawed at me in every quiet moment. And now, just like that, it was gone. The storm Maddie caused wasn't erased, but my dad's voice beside me solidified one piece of ground I no longer had to worry about. Looking back on it, the contrast was almost comical. One night he was the authoritarian, hammering down a verdict as though my wedding doubled as a courtroom. The next he was nervous, searching for words, apologizing, promising me unconditionally that he would be where he belonged, beside me, not against me. It was a sharp swing, but it was also the pivot that let me breathe again. My wedding morning wouldn't be defined by his ultimatum. It would be defined by the fact that, finally, he understood. That moment of relief stayed with me. It didn't solve every problem, and Maddie's behavior still lingered as the dark cloud she'd chosen to create. But at least now, I wasn't bracing for my father to make things worse. For once, he had stepped off the seesaw of divided loyalties and planted himself firmly back where I needed him. That shift gave me just enough peace to carry forward into the day ahead. What I didn't anticipate, though, was that Maddie wasn't done. While he was pulling himself back toward reason, she was finding fuel for a fresh performance. And that meant just when the calm seemed possible, new fallout was already on its way. The fallout nobody saw coming. When the dust from the rehearsal dinner began to clear, Maddie wasn't ready to disappear quietly. Instead of letting the embarrassment fade, she woke up the next morning already prepared to escalate. She marched to my dad's house in tears, spinning a new version of events where she was the victim who had been unfairly attacked by me and my fiancé. To hear her tell it, she hadn't been the one monopolizing conversations for weeks. She had simply been humiliated out of nowhere. Her behavior that morning turned small wounds into spectacle. Relatives later told me she railed for hours, accusing everyone of taking sides and painting herself as the fragile younger sister whose only crime was once dating the man I was about to marry. According to her, the rest of us had turned cruel, and she was the tragic figure being shaped into the villain. When words weren't enough, the tears came again, loud and messy, her exit punctuated with slammed doors like she was auditioning for a part in something nobody wanted to watch. But texts and phone calls quickly followed. She reached out to my dad repeatedly, crying, pleading, insisting that he had betrayed her by taking my side. Every unanswered call turned into another flood of messages, each one reshaping the narrative to make her seem more wronged. This wasn't sulking. It was a campaign to recast herself as the centerpiece of the conflict and force people into choosing sides. For my dad, the weight of that campaign hit hard. His initial instinct to defend Maddie at the rehearsal dinner had backfired, and by the time he admitted to me he had been wrong, he was tangled in a mess of his own making. Publicly, he had promised to support me, to stand by my side, and the relief from that moment was something I held close. But privately at home, the walls of his own house turned against him. After he apologized to me, Maddie and his wife turned on him, guilting him, freezing him out, making daily life miserable. He thought admitting the truth to me would end the fighting, but instead it split his household wide open. Maddie's fixation grew louder every day leading up to the ceremony. She insisted over and over that she had been ganged up on, that our family had chosen me over her, and that her humiliation at the dinner somehow proved everyone was out to get her. She refused to admit any fault. She refused to acknowledge the weeks she had spent making me and my fiancé uncomfortable. Instead, she doubled down on being the injured party, telling anyone who would listen that her older sister had destroyed her and her father had abandoned her. What stood out most wasn't her words, but the way people reacted. At first, some relatives had tried to temper her, offering polite nods in those early conversations, but by the end of the wedding weekend, the patience had run out. People had seen her smug interruptions with their own eyes. They'd seen her act out at the dinner. They knew the context, even if she wanted to bury it. When she whispered her version of events during the wedding weekend, the responses got shorter, cooler. Eyes rolled. Heads turned away. Sympathy dried up because everyone understood the truth. She wasn't being cut down by her family. She was exhausting them. That gap between the drama she tried to maintain and the reality everyone else saw left my dad in an impossible position. At the ceremony itself, he stepped into the role he promised, walking me down the aisle with a steady smile and whispered words that steadied me more than I realized I needed. But once the music, photos, and cake were behind us, his other reality came crashing back. At home, the pair waiting for him weren't beaming relatives. They were Maddie and his wife, ready to remind him that siding with me meant siding against them. His attempt to balance two worlds collapsed. If he leaned toward me, she accused him of abandonment. If he tried to soothe her, she accused him of hypocrisy. There was no middle ground left. The wedding itself revealed how much power Maddie had already lost. Instead of arriving with the grace of someone determined to put the tension behind her, she entered with swollen eyes and carried herself like a defendant waiting to testify. She avoided me completely, cried to anyone who made eye contact, and spoke in sharp whispers to whichever relatives hadn't yet turned away. Each attempt at sympathy only reinforced the divide. Her desperation to be consoled made her look less like a victim and more like the spectacle she had been trying so hard not to be. I could feel the shift around the room. Guests put their focus where it belonged, on me and my new husband, Jake. The big moments belonged to us, untouched by her noise. The ceremony, the vows, even the photographs now hold space for the people who chose to stand in joy, not drama. But alongside those moments, Maddie's behavior created a side story people couldn't ignore entirely. It became less about her words and more about the awkwardness she created by refusing to step back. For my dad, though, the glare of that outcome lingered. While the rest of us could head into celebration, he had to return home to a fractured household. Every effort he made to repair bridges snapped again under the pressure of Maddie's resentment and his wife's alignment with her. The very pressure he had thought he could control at the start, the reason he convinced me to invite Maddie in the first place, had exploded into a situation where his home no longer gave him peace. What began as a small compromise about guest lists and seating charts left him cornered in his own house, trapped between broken loyalties. For me, the fallout didn't erase the core of the day. The wedding happened. Despite the noise, despite Maddie's scenes, despite the ultimatums and late-night bargaining, Jake and I were married exactly as we intended. We said the vows, my dad walked me down the aisle after all, the celebration carried forward, and the people who mattered stood with us. Maddie wanted her narrative to define the wedding, but all it truly defined was the distance between those who came to celebrate and those who came to compete. And that is where the real final note lies. Not in her theatrics, not in my dad's torn loyalties, but in the reminder that what survives beyond weddings is often the character people show under pressure. Some lean into grace, others cling to spectacle. And the line between the two, once exposed in front of everyone, doesn't fade easily. That truth lingered beyond the final toast, shaping how everyone spoke about what they'd witnessed. In the end, the wedding went forward the way it was meant to. My dad apologized, promised never to weaponize the aisle again, and kept his place by my side as I walked. Maddie refused to own her part, refused to apologize, and was sent home before the ceremony began. And me? I got married, with the drama pushed to the background where it belonged. Now I'd love to hear from you. What's the most awkward or chaotic thing you've ever seen at a wedding? Drop it in the comments. And if you enjoy messy family stories told with a side of humor, hit subscribe. Because honestly, after everything, the only real ultimatum that night was the mic drop Maddie gave her.